Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Loretta Turner to talk about cultures of well-being, belonging, and care. Loretta, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Alex.
So, for people who are hearing you for the very first time, could you please share your superhero origin story?
Superhero origin story. Goodness. I would say it started sometime around college. I was studying undergrad. In undergrad, I was studying psychology and was super fascinated by the studies. But then I had this really interesting thing that happened where I found yoga, or yoga found me. I'm not really sure which way it went, but that opened up this whole curiosity around all things wellness and well-being and how to really not just care for yourself, but really know yourself and connect to yourself and study yourself. And as I continued to study, I also got deeper into yoga and meditative practices, became a yoga teacher, and then kind of found nonprofits. And I would say, not that I necessarily advocate for like wearing capes, because I think saviorism can be a little bit of a slippery slope, especially for our nonprofit folks. But probably one of the first moments of my life where I felt kind of that superhero mentality of like, wow, I can do something in this world that's meaningful and impactful and help change lives was when I started teaching yoga for this nonprofit that was bringing yoga inside of prisons and hospitals and rehabilitation centers and homeless shelters. And that's really when that nonprofit social impact light bulb went off for me. So a bit of a happy accident, right? I started teaching yoga, doing this whole wellness thing, and then got access to the beautiful world of offering these stress relieving practices for people who really needed it the most. And the rest is kind of history. I haven't been able to shake nonprofit since.
There's a lot of people that kind of tumble into the sector and they just don't want to leave because it's so welcoming and so many good people and less egos and more about helping community. I'm also happy to hear the mindfulness and the meditation and the yoga part because I do the same thing too. I actually practice yoga and I meditate every day. So there's a certain balance I hope to achieve at one point, at least in the future. And I can see how that can lead to a desire to overall pay attention to your well-being, and to bring that to the nonprofit world is awesome.
Mhm.
But let's start with a nice global definition because I like to start more high level and work our way to the details. So if you were to define well-being in the context of a nonprofit, how would you do so?
Mhm. I typically work with this one definition of well-being that I really love from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And the definition says, in so many words, that well-being encompasses the multiple needs in our lives, right? To find wholeness and well-being, we need to have our basic needs met. We also need to have our needs related to physical health and emotional health and social health and even financial health met. So really it's this holistic whole picture of making sure that all of our needs are met. But then there's this other piece of the definition that I love, which includes having opportunities and access to creating meaningful futures. And I really like the second part of that definition, especially as it relates to the nonprofit world, because I don't feel like we've typically thought about nonprofit careers as something as being sustainable, something that can set us up for prosperous futures. The rhetoric that we typically hear is that you don't get into nonprofits for the money. You get into it because of the passion and because of the impact and because of the work that you get to do. And that's wonderful, right? That's all fine and good. But if we're thinking about well-being, especially this definition of well-being, of getting all of your needs met and having opportunities to create meaningful futures, well, then I think that means we have to look at nonprofit work a little bit differently. How can we look at nonprofit work through this lens of being prosperous, of being careers that can actually sustain us and sustain our well-being for the long haul?
I love this definition. So multiple needs. Did I get them right? Physical, mental, social, financial. Is that the four that you mentioned?
Yeah, those four, and I would even go beyond that. I mean, I think well-being encompasses all aspects of our lives. So those are the big ones, but I would even include social needs and even spiritual needs included in that as well. Mental health needs, emotional needs are all parts of it.
Which I agree. I think there's a lot. I mean, we as humans need more than just one thing. These are some great starting points. And then you said what I like also access to meaningful situations or and opportunities. That to me is also something you don't often hear about in the nonprofit world. To your point, it's not
Mhm.
supposed to be about the money, it's supposed to be about the impact. But I think that is limiting. It's a limiting belief. People should be able to prosper, not just financially, but in every aspect of their lives working at a nonprofit. And I would even go to say that it's interesting how some CEOs of big companies make crazy amounts of money, but they're always or usually focused on the dollars and revenue and so forth, versus nonprofits, CEOs and directors don't make as much, and yet they're really making an impact in the world. And it's interesting to see that. I almost would love to see the reverse happen, the opposite, right? The ones who are making the biggest impact in the community should be the ones with the biggest salaries and opportunities and titles. And I had a guest on a few weeks ago talking about like celebrity chefs, how they were at one point nothing particular, and all of a sudden there was a big boom of popularity, and now they're in the rage. I would love to see
Mhm.
something similar happen for nonprofit directors.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, definitely on that topic of wealth building for nonprofit folks. Again, the language around creating meaningful futures really stands out in this definition because not only are nonprofit folks highly underpaid compared to some other sectors, I just also see these other hoops that I feel like nonprofits have to jump through to lead these really connected and prosperous lives. Here in the States, if you work in a nonprofit or you do some type of like social impact or servant focused service work, you could be eligible for getting your loans forgiven, right? That's a lovely perk that comes with nonprofit work. But anyone who's listening to this who is a part of that loan forgiveness program, namely PSLF, you know that it's not easy. You know that it's a million and one hoops that you have to jump through. And so, yeah, it's when I think about, again, future opportunities and building wealth and having prosperous lives and creating futures for yourself and the next generation, if you choose nonprofits, you're in a lot of ways choosing a path that isn't terribly fruitful.
So, in your opinion, is having well being inside an organization a way to compensate for a lack of financial opportunities? Or is wellness just more of a piece of the pie that should always be there? And for some reason, a lot of organizations tend to neglect. Like, I'm just curious to see if there's a correlation, not a causation, but a correlation between mindfulness and wellness and belonging and care and the nonprofit space and in the nonprofit space and like opportunities for wealth. Like, is it, they talk about wellness in general in for-profit companies, but I have a sense that because nonprofits in general seem to take care of others more than themselves, there's like a gap in their own not desire, but their own like they tend not to focus on themselves, they focus on others. And as a result, sometimes they can have side effects, negative side effects. And I believe the conversation of well-being is more popular in nonprofits, and I'm just trying to see again if there's a balance between that and the opportunity side of things, or it's just irrespective of the whatever you are in your wealth and your opportunities, well-being should always be part of a nonprofit.
Mm. Yeah, great question. Really great question. A couple of different ways I want to answer it. I think I'll come back to the wealth piece second. Personally, I think well-being needs to be embedded into the roots and the core and the infrastructure of any and all nonprofits, regardless of what the mission is. I think so many folks that are working in nonprofits are working towards missions that are so noble and so meaningful and take a lot out of us, right? They take a lot of our knowledge and intellectual energy as well as our emotional energy, and in some cases a lot of our physical energy. I'm thinking about living here in Southern California and everything that happened in LA with the wildfires. How many nonprofits were literally like on ground making sure that people had access to services? And I'm based in San Diego, and I was even hearing of our local nonprofits like making the trip to LA every single day to be on ground to meet the needs of others. And so from that perspective, again, regardless of what the mission is, I think elements of well-being need to be deeply integrated into organizational infrastructure, organizational culture, and norms so that folks have, again, these norms and these narratives that they are also worthy causes, right? They're working towards worthy causes or working for worthy causes, but them as individuals are also worthy of rest, worthy of support, worthy of care, worthy of connection, worthy of having access to good healthcare, worthy of having access to benefits that can help them fully recover and care for themselves and feel not only supported in their work, but like they can do their work with dignity. So that's a whole soapbox that I'm sure I'll step back on in this conversation. But pivoting to the question around the wealth piece, I think well-being also plays a critical role there. Now, do I necessarily think that nonprofit infrastructure in my lifetime is going to pivot in a way that all nonprofit folks are on track to be like some of the most wealthiest people in the world? No, I don't necessarily see that. But I also think about, I think I have a different relationship with the word wealth, or I have a different definition, that it's not about necessarily greed or hoarding as much money as possible, but it's about having not just enough, but a little bit more than enough to be able, again, to live a prosperous life, but to also like build a sustainable future for yourself and for the next generation, and also for the communities that you live in. I mean, I'll just use myself as an example. When I think about my ethos and the way that I care about community and care about the world, if I were able to access a job that afforded me more income and I was able to build financial wealth, I know that I would be the type of person who would want to invest that back into my community. I'd want to start my own foundation, or I'd want to be able to give that money away and help build community care. And so when I think about, the correlation between well-being and wealth in the sector, I think it's more so about setting up our nonprofit workforce so that people can first and foremost care for themselves, build sustainable futures for themselves and for their families. Another example I would use is that, here in Southern California, here in San Diego, it's incredibly expensive to live here. It's become so highly unaffordable for many people, and many of those people are nonprofit people, right? So the wealth piece is like, how do we build well-being infrastructure in our sector so that people can afford to live in the city that they care about, so people can afford to live in the city that they're trying to serve, and then get folks to a place where they can set up sustainable futures for themselves so that they can, again, live prosperous lives. They can set up the next generation for a life of prosperity, and they can invest whatever extra money they have into taking better care of the community. And I would add another piece of that. One of the slices of well-being, many slices of well-being that I advocate for, especially here in Southern California, is just wage equity. Wage equity is a huge piece of, our folks that are on ground doing some of the most meaningful and important work in our region, in our sector, are not making a livable wage, right? So sometimes the wealth conversation is as basic as people need livable wages here, and then we can start to have a conversation about, well, what does a thriving wage look like to really set people up for success in the sector?
Okay, so because wealth is definitely one topic we could talk about a bit more, but and I know it has some relationship to well-being, but I don't want to go too far off the topic for well-being. But I get what you said. I mean, I agree. Also, equity, livable wage, thriving wage. These are very important questions to ask. I'm curious to know, in the sense of achieving well-being, would you say that it's? I mean, we're kind of rehashing what you just said, but the worthy of the support, worthy of care, worthy of benefits. Like, in order for a nonprofit to know that they've achieved well-being, what would be some of the earmarks or the markers of it? Was it those things I just mentioned, that you mentioned earlier, or is it something else? Like, maybe I should start with the question of, what are the symptoms of not having well-being before we get to the actual well-being? But it's trying to define a structure or an organization that is aiming towards well-being. What does it mean to achieve it? We'll start maybe with the goal, and then we'll start with the symptoms. We'll do the symptoms after.
Sure. Yeah, I like this question. The first thing that came to mind is that the word achievement for me is maybe not exactly the word that I would use. I think that success with well-being initiatives is more about coming into alignment or finding better balance. And that's really the focus of the work that I'm doing with Do Good Leadership Collective. It's really about helping our leaders and their people come into balance, first and foremost within themselves, right? Finding that balance within themselves, however they define well-being, right? What does it really mean to be well in your own body, in your own mind, in your own life? and get good there. And then once folks can do that, once they can find that alignment within themselves, that balance within themselves, then the conversation is making sure that everyone is in alignment with the mission. I would say, again, success on an organizational level, like the way that I would see it or witness it, is that people feel good in their own lives. People feel like they're aligned with the work that they're doing, and they're not losing sight of themselves along the way. They haven't sacrificed themselves along the way. They haven't lost sight of their own sense of worthiness. So then I guess the question is, well, what does it look like to find that alignment? And I would say that it looks like creating the conditions where people at all levels of the organization feel resourced, they feel supported, they feel like they're able to really navigate the demands of their work in healthy ways. Again, without feeling like they have to sacrifice themselves. Being able to do the work and say, okay, I'm just going to take a really crappy salary to be able to do this work, or be upfront and close and personal with this work and say, like, all right, I'm going to do this even though I don't have access to healthcare. I say success is, again, these conditions where people can do this work and they actually have the resources that they need. They actually feel supported. They feel really connected to themselves. They feel like they can ask for what they need. And again, they really have their sense of worth intact, right? They have that healthy self-esteem and healthy self-confidence intact. I'd also say that coming into well-being alignment, it isn't just like the work of self-care. Like, it isn't just like, oh, we're doing the well-being thing because like we're getting enough sleep. It's also about designing workplaces that can really hold people in the work that they do and get really honest with people about like, what does it really take to resource you so that you can do this job, not just well, but from a place where you feel like you're doing a good job, you're meeting the impact, and you're also thriving. You're also healthy.
I really appreciate the fact that you said it starts with alignment with yourself first and then the mission, because like every relationship, you have to love yourself first before you can love someone else. So, and even with the airplane thing, right? Put your mask on first and then you can help someone else. So you have to make sure that you're in a good place first, and then you can extend that goodness outside and beyond you.
I agree. And I think that's something that's come up more recently with a lot of the nonprofit leaders I've been working with. I think throughout the pandemic, we were talking about this burnout thing. And the way that I was tapped in to help burnout was by coming in and doing these workshops and talking about how we can, get rid of burnout, and how can we rest more, and how can we work on having healthier workloads, and just like having healthier organizational culture. But more recently, as the world has become increasingly more challenging and there's been a lot of uncertainty, the conversation has gone a few layers deeper. It's not just about like talking to the whole organization about managing burnout. It's really about getting close with these leaders, getting close with these nonprofit professionals on an individual level, and asking them to really look in the mirror and look deep within and have conversations about their own sense of agency, their own self-esteem, their confidence. And at the top of our conversation, I said, I'm not sure if I'm really an advocate for cape wearing and saviorism, because some of the things that I see at the core with these leaders is that they've adopted some of these mentalities that haven't been the healthiest. We have a lot of martyrs in our sector. We have people that are caught up in saviorism, or the big one that I'm guilty of is I get caught up in competitiveness and scarcity mindsets. So I'm seeing right now that the work is really about shifting the narratives of what it really means at the individual level to be in relationship with this work. And how do we change that? How do we come into better alignment with ourselves and how we view ourselves in our work? How do we have a better relationship with our own sense of worth and self-esteem so that we can do this work well, really ask for what we need so that we can be thriving in this work. And again, it really starts as an inside job.
I picked up on one word you mentioned earlier where you talked about how well-being is different for everyone. And yet, so far in the conversation, all the attributes, all the different portions of wellness seem to be pretty consistent, and I think could be applied to most people. Like, these are more concepts than actual tactical pieces. So where does the individual come into play? Like, I understand that, alignment might be slightly different for person A than person B, but everything we've talked about so far, like I said, is a principle. Alignment is a general concept, not a specific one. So Where does the individuality come from, right? Or how does it get introduced into this conversation?
This is a good question because I think it is a dance between the individual work and then also recognizing that the work of well-being is also collective responsibility. And so when I think about a team and perhaps they have a well-being goal in mind, right? Folks all have to contribute to that goal and be in alignment with that goal so that there is this norm of how we all work together, how we all practice belonging, how we all care for one another. And at the same time, again, there is this individual work. And I think the big thing that's coming up for me around individuality is that, maybe the playbook is the same, that everyone needs to be getting more rest. Everyone needs to be making sure that they're getting enough sleep. Everyone needs to make sure that they've got, maybe some of the right insights and education around well-being, whether it be financial well-being or social well-being. Maybe everyone, I would argue, needs access to a coach or access to like a mental health professional to navigate well-being during these times. So the playbook and maybe the prescription is really the same for everyone. But I think at the individual level, what is different but also necessary for each person is self-accountability. I think at the individual level, folks not only have to do the work around building their confidence, building their self-esteem, and getting really honest about the better ways that they need to be taking care of themselves, but they need to hold themselves accountable. I feel like I saw this quite a bit over the last 5 years, especially throughout the pandemic, where things got really hard, things got really busy, people got overwhelmed, people got burnt out, and I frequently saw folks kind of like turning to their organizations and pointing at their organizations and blaming their organizations, blaming the top leaders, blaming the board. I'm struggling and I'm not well, and that's because you're not paying me enough, or you're not giving me the right infrastructure and the right support that I need. And there could be a lot of truth to that. And there is often a lot of truth to that. And what I discovered with a lot of these individuals is that in addition to maybe needing different supports or a better infrastructure from the organization that they're working in, at the individual level, people have to be doing the work to be better taking care of themselves. People have to be doing the individual work to set boundaries, to advocate for themselves, to speak up, to know when to say no, to know when to be courageous and to raise their hand, to know when to be courageous and take a step back. So the individual work, again, is recognizing that we all play an individual role in creating collective care and well-being, and the individual role is very much rooted in self-accountability and being really honest with yourself about where you could be taking better care of yourself.
I have a strong notion that a lot of people, and I don't know why I'm going to typecast it, but the younger generations, and it seems, they'd like to point that finger more than older. I just
I
don't know
almost said it, but I didn't. I almost said that
I'm going to throw it out there.
The folks that were typically pointing fingers were, I'm a millennial, right? So I would say some folks in my generation, but I saw it more frequently from Generation Z, what I will say is I love Gen Z. I think they're super cool. I would love to be Gen Z in a lot of ways. And I respect Gen Z for waving this flag of like, we don't like the way that this leadership thing is playing out. Like, we don't feel cared for, we don't feel supported. And I love that they've brought all that to the surface. And there's some self-accountability work that needs to come with that.
Yeah, because it definitely, you have to start with knowing that you have a part to play and that you can't ignore your part. So it has to start with yourself first, and then you can, raise your hand, set your boundaries, be courageous, and be honest with yourself. I think that's a fundamental starting point, and not just play a blame game. So happy you mentioned that as well. We talked earlier about, I used the word achieving well-being. You kind of said more coming into alignment. I'm curious to know, before that happens, at early stages, as things are happening, maybe there are some finger pointing or whatnot. What are some symptoms that nonprofits can notice to say, hang on a second, we seem to have a problem here, and it might be related to well-being? Like, what would be those things to look out for that will give hints that something needs to be done?
Mm-hmm. I'll go broad and then kind of pare it down a little bit. I would say like a broad symptom or a common symptom that I've seen is burnout. But also, I like to inform people that burnout is actually a combination of a number of different symptoms. I think we use the word burnout pretty loosely, but burnout is actually an occupational experience that ultimately says that we are having these three other symptoms, and now we've kind of like met the crux of a situation. And those three other symptoms are cynicism, exhaustion, and a lack of professional efficacy. We can experience each of these by themselves, or we can have a pair of these, right? We can be feeling depersonalization and cynicism and also feeling exhausted and not necessarily be burnt out, right? So I just like to give that information that burnout is actually a very extreme case of being overwhelmed in a number of ways. But anyways, I'd say that burnout is kind of this bigger symptom. But if we are seeing cynicism or we're seeing fractures in relationships in the workplace, that could definitely mean that well-being isn't present. Obviously, if people are run down, they're exhausted, they're overwhelmed with deadlines, they can't manage their workload, that's a sign that well-being isn't present. And if folks feel like they just can't get their job done, or they're feeling completely disconnected from their work, or they have this kind of disillusionment that the work doesn't matter, right? That's also a sign that well-being isn't present. And so those are the symptoms. And then some of the outcomes that we see as a result of those symptoms is turnover, right? People are like, I'm out, I'm done, I can't do that, I can't do this anymore. So that's a symptom and also an outcome that points to a lack of well-being. Again, staff conflict, right? If you've got a whole group of people that are feeling depersonalization, they're feeling cynical, they don't know how to work together, they're not getting along, and now there's all this conflict, and you're spending all this time and all this money trying to solve conflicts, that's a sign that well-being isn't present. And then again, people performing poorly, disengaging from the work, making a lot of mistakes, people really slipping up, that's a sign that well-being isn't present. I will also say that there are some like major red flags that I've seen in organizations that to me are like an alarm is going off. Well-being is clearly not present in this organizational culture. And I'd say the three that I see are people just straight up abandoning their work, right? So it's like absenteeism. They're just not showing up anymore. They're completely dropping the ball on things. I've also seen people in organizations that are using up all of their PTO time before Q3 has even rolled around because they're just exhausted. They're just like, I just can't go, right? I need to take another day off. I'm too tired. I need to take another day off. That's a huge red flag. And probably the biggest one and the one that scares me the most and breaks my heart the most is the apathy. When I start to hear nonprofit staff talking about the people they serve or the communities they serve with negativity or with this apathetic tone, that they don't care about the work anymore. They don't care about helping people. It's all for nothing. This is a waste of my time. That one always kind of digs deep because I know that so many nonprofit people get into nonprofits because of their empathy, because of their passion, because of their care. And so to be in a situation that there's such a lack of well-being and burnout is so high and rampant that you're now mentally, emotionally in a place that you feel like you don't even care about the work anymore, that's just such a major red flag. And again, that's one that typically scares me.
Yeah, those are three serious ones. I, for some reason, though, was thinking you might have mentioned a fourth, and that's disrespect. If you're being disrespected at work, that can also be, I think, a pretty bad one as well.
Yeah, hugely. Like when the conflict goes from we don't know how to work together to like we're now attacking each other. That's absolutely a sign.
Okay, so in these situations, is it typically the directors or the board or the individuals, maybe the volunteers, who raises the flag to say, hang on a second, like, we have an issue here, we need to do something about it? We talked about, individualism, being able to raise your hand when you do need help, but is it generally them who do raise the flag, or is there feedback to the directors and then they decide what to do next? Like, what are usually the next steps, or who are the people that start to realize that something needs to be done?
Yeah, bringing it back to the individualism, this is another piece of the accountability. Like it's one thing to look at the organization and point your fingers and blame and say, this isn't working for me because I don't have the resources I need. But then it's another thing to maybe be engaging in some of these behaviors that I mentioned, right? Like maybe attacking another coworker or taking all this time off or abandoning your work or gossiping. Like the accountability piece also speaks to like, are you fully aware of how you're behaving in your role and how you are also contributing to this culture, to these norms that do not promote well-being? So then the question is, like whose responsibility is it to then break some of these cycles? And I would argue that it's everyone's responsibility. That's the piece of the individuality. You have to really know what role you're playing and how you are contributing either positively or negatively to this culture, which again means it's everyone's responsibility to contribute to well-being in whatever way they can. Now, when it comes to decision making and maybe implementing some well-being policies or some well-being activities or initiatives, I say that it does need to come from the top. Leadership does play a crucial role in modeling well-being and making those decisions around well-being. Again, if you are the decision maker, like, you've got to be open to hearing these conversations and understanding like how people are looking to you and are following you and are following your lead, right? So you have to have that awareness to make sure that you're modeling it. But in addition to that, or I say alongside that, it is everyone's job. It is everyone's role. It is a shared responsibility to take the collective accountability. If we're thinking about it through the lens of how do I support well-being based on my job description, yeah, we all have to practice what we preach. But, you know, if you're in HR, you also know that you've got some control, or maybe you've got access to helping well-being initiatives be implemented from like the HR perspective. I would even think about people who fundraise, right? If I'm a former in-house director of development and former grant writer, I sometimes too felt like it was my responsibility to ask funders or to write grants in ways that could better support the needs of my team and better support the needs of the staff, and be able to ask for well-being through the fundraising efforts, or kind of restructure the way that we ask for well-being support through fundraising efforts. I think what we have to be careful to do is not think that it is the responsibility of just one person to fix the well-being, right? It's everyone's collective responsibility. We all have to walk the walk. We all have to lead by example. But yes, leadership at the top definitely has to model it. Those that are in decision-making positions definitely have to be talking about it. And everyone, regardless of their department or their role, has to be curious about what piece can I contribute to making this a reality for the entire organization. And I would also argue that that mentality is applicable to the board, and it is, of course, applicable to funders. They need to be included in these conversations about the well-being needs for staff. Everyone at all levels need to fully understand the benefit of creating a culture of well-being so that everyone can know their parts in the work and then stay accountable to upholding it.
So once this has been brought to the leader's attention, once a decision has been made that we need to spend more time on well-being, if they don't know to reach out to someone like yourself, are there usually some resources they can go to, or are there places that they can go to remedy the situation? Like where's a typical nonprofit to go to when they don't know to come to a specialist like yourself?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, because especially in this moment, in this age of nonprofit work, it's really tough to think about resources. Like I mentioned before, there's a lot of instability, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I know a lot of nonprofits, especially in the States, are in a place of kind of like triage, right? Needing to just meet the emergencies that are coming up and plan and brace for impact. So I think the resource conversation right now is particularly tricky, because we know that resources have historically been scarce for nonprofits, but when we're in a season like we are right now, it's a scary time to figure out how to spend money and how to be a decision maker around well-being. I've been saying to some folks, like I feel like a lot of leaders are faced with an impossible decision of money is tight, we've got a lot of uncertainty. I want to invest the money into taking care of our people and to doing well-being initiatives, but also like there's so much scary stuff happening that, you know, I want to make sure I'm planning accordingly and making the right decision. So to answer your question, I think one of the biggest resources and most accessible resources that nonprofits have is each other. We are living in a time where we really need to come together. We need to lock arms with one another and figure out solutions collectively. And I think that's true for well-being as well. I think rather than abandoning well-being and saying we don't have the resources for it, we don't have the time for it, we don't know who to call, I think step one is actually reaching out to fellow nonprofit leaders, reaching out to fellow organizations that maybe have similar missions that to the one that you have, and ask the question, what are you doing to take care of your staff right now? What ideas do you have around taking care of your staff? I think, again, the first thing an organization can do is lean into another organization and get curious about how they can use the collective people power and find collective innovation to create more spaces for staff to access well-being together. I've always had this like really cool and wonderful idea of, how can organization A that does maybe outdoor access stuff get connected to organization B that's involved in the arts, and then provide access to one another's staff to provide well-being resources. Like, hey, like, how about we use our resource of having access to well-being, whether it be state parks or state beaches, to like help get your staff out into the outdoors. And then your staff that's involved in the arts can help our staff get into some type of cultural event or cultural experience at a local museum, right? So that's kind of an example that I would think of. So in addition to leaning into one another, recognizing that nonprofits are already a fantastic resource for well-being. And I'll say this, like, I like to lean into my nonprofits for my own well-being needs. Like, I've got a garden in my yard, and I learned how to garden through my local nonprofit. And so, like, I just want nonprofits to remember, like, we've got well-being embedded into our own missions, into our own programming. So, like, lean into that and remind your staff that they have access to that, and remind other organizations that they can tap into those resources as well. But in addition to that, I think now is the time to bring in board members, to bring funders into this conversation. Like, ask those folks that are already resourcing or volunteering and supporting your community to really listen to the well-being needs and start to make a strong case for how different well-being initiatives need to be funded. I mean, I really think the first step is saying out loud, our people need help, and we need to figure out how to resource them. I think really one of the first things we can do, in addition to leaning into other nonprofits, is really talking out loud with your board and your funders about what the well-being needs are, telling the full story of like, what is the full cost of doing nonprofit work. If we've got all of these people that are burnt out, we've got all these people that are working overtime, that are really giving all of themselves to make this work happen, like, what does that actually cost? How can we get a more accurate dollar amount of what that cost is, and then ask for it so that we can compensate people fairly, and then also have some conversations about what people need to balance out the misalignment that they're feeling in their work. How do we start having conversations with boards and funders and saying, we need better healthcare plans, our people need access to mental health resources right now, our people need coaching, they need conflict resolution. We've got people that have been at this for over a decade. We want to plan for a sabbatical, or we just want to have some type of like ongoing well-being resource just to help folks get through this moment. So I think it's about really dreaming up what well-being would look like in your organization, and then doing the math around it, right? Crunching the numbers of what it really costs to run this organization and what it would actually look like and feel like to run an organization in a more thriving way, and start to have those conversations with the people that are resourcing your organization. And finally, some resources that I do want to offer up. Some other people that are in this movement and have wonderful toolkits and guidelines and all sorts of webinars and classes that folks might want to tap into and take to learn more about well-being in organizations. The first organization I want to plug here is Fund the People. They have an incredible talent justice movement. And their resources are oriented both towards nonprofit organizations that are trying to figure out how to better resource their nonprofit talent, but they also have a lot of toolkits that are oriented towards grant makers and funders, so that folks can have a better idea of how to have those conversations with funders around taking care of talent. And then the second organization that I want to plug here is the Nonprofit Finance Fund. The Nonprofit Finance Fund, they have an entire project called the Full Cost Project, which again is a resource, a budgeting resource to help organizations fully understand what is the actual cost that it takes to do our work.
Awesome. We'll make sure to put those links in the show notes below. So in addition to those resources, maybe they might have an ability to reach out to you as well. Could you share your contact information? How can people get in touch with you for further questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I founded an organization called Do Good Leadership Collective, and Our work is really about everything that I've just talked about in this podcast. Our tagline is helping social impact professionals do good and be well. We ultimately take a well-being approach to leadership development. And the way that we like to position ourselves is when an organization is ready and they see the need that their people are not well, people are dealing with that misalignment, there are fractures, there are tension, people are dropping like flies to, hit our line and let us come in and offer coaching, workshops, facilitation, retreats, ultimately container holding to help you and your organization and to help you and your people soften up a bit and open up about what are our well-being needs and what is it going to really take for us to get there. One of the things we offer is ultimately strategic guidance and figuring out how to almost operationalize well-being. What does well-being even mean for your organization? There's an organization here in San Diego that I've been working with. They ultimately meet the needs of families that have a child that's facing a life-threatening illness like cancer. And the staff is really close to that work, right? They're constantly driving families to the hospital and ultimately facing child mortality. So my question to them is, well, what is well-being for your staff that are facing this particular mission and holding maybe vicarious trauma? What does well-being really mean for them? What does it look like? How do you define it? And then what does it then look like to build a program or an infrastructure? Or how do we embed your well-being needs into your next strategic plan so that you know how to ask for the resources that people really need to thrive in this incredible work that they do? So that's a piece of our work, like some strategic framing and well-being planning. And then in addition to that, like I said, we offer leadership development. So we coach to well-being, we do workshops around well-being, we have and host staff retreats that help people really pull apart what well-being means to them and then bring it all together and figure out how to plan around it. So all things leadership development, all things helping and holding and guiding our nonprofit sector with the lens of collective care, well-being, and belonging at the core.
Awesome. Loretta, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much for doing what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm grateful to live in a time where we can actually talk about this.
Agreed. All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.